Hey everybody, it's Drewby with DailyRoto here. Going to talk how to win DraftKings NFL Showdown contest. It's been a pretty crazy few weeks for me. Almost $250,000 in Showdown profits, which is very surreal to say the least. But it's been something that is obviously a lot of luck, but a lot of hard work that goes into it too, leveraging the DailyRoto tools and processes. So the first one was back Baltimore at Cincinnati. That was the week that Tyler Boyd really went off. The market was really high on John Ross that week, and I was able to capture almost $16,000, $15,000 profit in that Baltimore at Cincy contest. And then had another big week just a few weeks later with the Washington Redskins New Orleans Saints contest. That was Traquan Smith's coming out party. You can see the lineup here that tied for first place, $175,000 profit on that, with Drew Brees as my captain putting up 46 points. Pretty chalky lineup in general. You know, you have Drew Brees, Alex Smith, Chris Thompson, the PPR back for Washington. And then Mark Ingram and Cameron Meredith and Traquan Smith were really what separated this. It was Mark Ingram's first game back, and so people were still really high on Alvin Kamara, but the projections over at DailyRoto liked Ingram as a good value there, and building 150 lineups, I wanted to get exposure to both. And then the other unique thing about this lineup was that had Drew Brees, but didn't pair him up with Michael Thomas. Instead, went with both Cameron Meredith and Traquan Smith. First game that Ted Ginn was out, and so there were a lot of, I guess, question marks around the industry as far as what the roles of these two receivers would be. And capturing a low-priced, high upside performance from Traquan Smith, that 15% ownership was a big separation there. And then another big night last night, Miami Dolphins versus the Houston Texans, $55,000 return on $1,500. So more than a $50,000 profit. Again, pretty surreal. These are really high variance contests. And so even if you're putting together great lineups, it's unlikely that you're going to win this frequently in such a short stretch of time. But you can see over the winning roster, and you can see Kenyon Drake was in my captain spot. DeAndre Hopkins and Will Fuller, both were popular plays, but Fuller definitely a little bit less so at less than 50% owned. And then the big separation was pairing Deshaun Watson with both those guys, but also adding tight end Jordan Thomas, who's just 2.5% owned. Not only was he a good value, but he also freed up a lot of salary for you to jam in some of those Texans studs. And so Thomas was really what provided the separation there. Ended up in a tie for first place again in this contest, tied with a bunch more people this time. I think there were 8 or so people that ended up with that tie, but 160 point lineup. So another big night. I'm going to walk through how to create and win NFL DFS contests on DraftKings using the DailyRoto optimizer. It's something all of our subscribers have access to over at DailyRoto. Go through in the drop down and you can select the Miami at Houston game, and you can see our customizable projections that are set up here. There's a bunch of different things that you can do for Showdown contests that make it really unique. Over on the left-hand side, you can create groups for the individual players, and then you can also control their captain exposure. And that was one of the things that I found really valuable as part of this product is, if you're just running the lineups through an optimizer, you're going to get a ton of Deshaun Watson and Hopkins as your captain, and you're not necessarily going to get a good deal of diversity on those selections. So I wanted to make sure that I was able to get some diversity there. And ultimately, I think my success in Showdown has come to leveraging our groups features. The groups can be done in a couple different ways. So I'm just going to walk through some of the groups that I had for last night's contest. You can see all of the groups that I've created down here in the optimizer. So Deshaun Watson, as you can create separate groups for a player when they're a captain versus when they're just in your lineup regularly. And so you can see when Deshaun Watson is the captain, one of the things I did was make sure that he was paired up with at least 2 of DeAndre Hopkins, Will Fuller, Jordan Thomas, Lamar Miller, Tyler Ervin. Those were the guys that I expected to be able to have the most PPR upside on DraftKings in the format. And I felt that if Watson was the captain, he was going to have a monster night. And in order for that to happen, he was going to have to connect with multiple weapons. Because if all his targets and all his volume went to DeAndre Hopkins, then the likely thing was going to be that Watson wouldn't be the captain, Hopkins would be the captain. So the only way for Watson really to emerge as the captain was to have multiple people go off. And that's one of the mistakes that I see with people creating Showdown lineups, is that they'll put captains and they won't think about the implications of that on the rest of the roster. So another example of this, you can look at my Will Fuller captain group. So if Will Fuller is going to be the captain, Deshaun Watson is going to have a big night, and he's probably going to be on the winning rosters. So you see some lineups out there that have Will Fuller as the captain and they don't have Deshaun Watson on the roster. And that doesn't make a lot of sense logically. It's something you can really easily set up and configure within the DailyRoto Showdown optimizer. And a bunch of different groups there. So I go through and I kind of create groups for each player based on if they're captain, dictating what's going to happen with the rest of my roster. You can see, 8, 9, 10 different groups of captain keys right there. It takes about half an hour to set up, but when you have guys like Drew Dinkmeyer, Mike Leone, Ricky Sanders, Chris Pacheco, who are doing all the projections, it frees up time for subscribers and for me just to focus on creating groups and not really worrying about the projections. And that's something that has been pretty big for me, honestly. And some of the other groups that are a little bit more basic, they kind of vary slate by slate, but you can see I created a group for the Miami running backs. Kenyon Drake and Frank Gore had been a little bit of a timeshare. Definitely we were higher on Drake, and so I had a lot more exposure to him. But I wanted to make sure that if I was playing Drake, that I wasn't playing Gore in the same roster. And that's another mistake that I see some people make. I know it's won in the past on some Showdown slates, that like the Denver Broncos one was, a slate I lost $1,000, $1,500 in that slate because you had to have 2 running backs in your rosters from the same team in order to win Showdown. And if you're not winning Showdown, you're probably losing. Just because there's so much money up at the top of those pools and there's so high variance because of the captain. But I felt like there was no way that if Drake was going to have a big game, that Gore was also going to need to be in the winning rosters. And the same situation on the Houston running back side. So I did the same thing with Lamar Miller and Alfred Blue. Felt like if Miller got the full workload that he needed to pay off his salary, that it was going to mean that Blue wasn't going to have a big game. I did leave Tyler Ervin out of that group because I felt like he was going to play more of the slot role. And so his snaps weren't necessarily tied to Miller's snaps. They were more tied to the success of the passing attack in general. Kind of go through and you can create a bunch of different groups. Same thing on the tight end front. So Mike Gesicki and Nick O'Leary, they were both factoring into the game. We didn't really have, we had Gesicki ahead on kind of talent in the role, but with O'Leary coming back, didn't really know. What I did feel comfortable was that they weren't both going to go off. And so at most one of the Miami tight ends in the same lineups. And that's one of the beauties of the optimizer in the process is you can create these groups for when somebody's a captain and when they're not. And it really allows you to build high upside lineups. Within the settings, you can also do some things that I think help with your player exposure. One of the things that I like to play with the most is the shuffle setting. So the shuffle gives you a random sampling from some of the top lineups. And when I first went through and ran the lineups, I was getting a ton of Hopkins and not really enough Fuller. And I wanted exposure to both of them. I know Fuller had been kind of down a little bit in the recent weeks, but with Kuti out, felt like it was an opportunity for Fuller to get back in. And by increasing the level of shuffle, I was able to generate more lineups with Will Fuller in it. And that ended up being something that ended up very profitable. One of the things you can see about my lineups is it's a really wide distribution of lineups. So for every lineup I had towards the top, had a bunch close to the bottom. And that's one of the great features of the shuffle over at DailyRoto is the ability to generate lineups that have a wide distribution. And it varies really depending on the slate. In this one, I used a shuffle of 10. If it's a slate where there's less conviction over some of the top plays like Watson, Hopkins, and Fuller, then I might use a different size shuffle. But that's kind of how I would go about building lineups for DraftKings NFL Showdown. If you want to check out the DailyRoto product, you can save 10% with the promo Showdown at checkout. And I definitely recommend that if you're building Showdown lineups, build them with intent. Make sure you're setting up rules so that if someone is captain, what does it mean for the rest of your roster? And that's going to go a long way. Obviously, it's been a really fortunate run that I've been on. Really lucky to have this much success. You could play Showdown for 5 years and be a great player and never see a single victory. But a lot of fortune on my side, and so wanted to give a little back, talk a little bit about my strategy, and hopefully you guys will check out our product at DailyRoto. I'm really proud of the team and what they've put together and all the projections that go into it.